She was 41 years old, and by the last cold week of that autumn, she owned nothing in the world but a threadbare coat, a tin cup, and a grief she had stopped explaining to anyone. It was Ezra Crane, who kept the bank in Halcyon Bend and smiled like a man counting other people's money, who had taken the rest her husband's mill, her house on Ash Lane, the very quilt off her bed, and called it lawful. When the notes came due in the year, the whole country went hungry. She had $19.40 left, folded small and sweated soft in the toe of her boot, and with almost every coin of it, she bought a thing that made grown men laugh into their collars. A rotting ferry boat, half sunk at the old South Landing, sold to her for $11 by a clerk who could not believe his luck. The Kingfisher, it had once been called, though the name had peeled to a ghost. Its ribs showed like a starved animal's. Water stood black in its belly. Anyone with sense would have called her a fool, and most of Halcyon Bend did, out loud. But there was something the mockers did not know, something sealed and sleeping deep in that ruined hull, something that would not only rewrite the whole of her broken life, but wake a forgotten town back into being. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Marielle Voss. If you are watching from a place the world drove past and forgot, a town, a house, a life someone wrote off as finished, tell us in the comments where you're from, because this story was made for you. She had not always been poor, though she had never once been soft. Marielle Voss was born on the wrong bank of the Cottonwood River in the spring of 1852, the daughter of a boatwright named Otto Voss, who could look at a warped plank the way other men looked at scripture, seeing in it the shape it had been made to hold. Their house smelled of pine pitch and river mud and the sweet scorch of steam-bent oak, and Marielle grew up under the long shadow of the drying racks, handing her father tools before he knew he wanted them. He taught her the thing that would matter most, though neither of them could have guessed it then. He taught her that a boat is not a shape, but a promise, that every seam is a vow made to the water, and that a hull, if it is built true, will keep its cargo dry through storms that drown lesser things. Water finds the lie in everything, he used to say, tapping a joint until it rang. Build so, there is no lie in it, and the river will carry you home. She learned to caulk and to plane, to read the grain, to trust her hands over her fears. She learned patience from the slow work of bending wood, and she learned that the most valuable things are often the ones that look, to the careless eye, like nothing at all. Her mother taught her the other half. Ilse Voss kept a garden that fed half the lane in bad years and asked for nothing back but company, and she had a way of gathering the forgotten of Halcyon Bend to her table, the widow, the drunkard's children, the old ferryman who had no family of his own. That ferryman was Absalom Reed, and he is the second thread of this story, though he was already old when Marielle was young. Absalom ran the Cottonwood crossing before the wooden bridge went up, poling folk and their wagons and their milk cows from the poor south bank to the prosperous north where the market square sat. And he did it, everyone agreed, for less than the work was worth. He carried people who could not pay. He carried the doctor free, always, at any hour. And on winter evenings he sat at Ilse Voss's table and told a girl with sawdust in her braids that a river town lives or dies by whether its people can reach one another, and that a ferry is not a boat but a bridge with a heart. Marielle married a quiet, decent man named Peter Voss, a cousin so distant the shared name was near coincidence, a miller who ground the valley's wheat at the little mill below the falls. They were not blessed with children who lived, and that sorrow sat in the house like a fourth chair no one used, but they filled the empty room with work and kindness, and the mill hummed, and for 20 years the two of them were quietly, unshowily happy. She kept the mill's books in a clean, sloping hand. She mended the ferryman's old boat when his hands grew too knotted to do it, patching the Kingfisher season after season out of love for the man who had carried her mother's kindness across the water for 40 years. And when Absalom Reed died quietly, in his sleep, in the winter of 1889, with no kin to mourn him and the new bridge already stealing his trade, it was Marielle who washed and dressed the old boat one last time and tied it at the South Landing, because she could not bear to see it broken up for firewood. That mattered later. Nearly everything she had ever done out of love mattered later, though she did not know it yet. And that is the quiet arithmetic of a good life. The debts you forgive come back to you by roads you never see. Then the world turned over. It began, as ruin so often does, with paper. The panic of 1893 came down out of the east like a cold front, banks failing in cities Marielle had never seen. And by summer, the price of flour had fallen so far that the mill could not clear its costs. Peter took a loan from Ezra Crane's bank to see them through the lean months. A small loan, secured, he thought, by the goodwill of a lifetime and the value of a mill his own father had built. But goodwill is not a thing that appears in a ledger, and Ezra Crane read only ledgers. Crane had come to Halcyon Bend 15 years before, with a black coat and a soft voice and a habit of buying, at the courthouse steps, the debts of dying men. He had bought up the mortgages of half the South Bank. He had bought the note on the general store and the note on the smithy and the note on the little brick school. And he held them all in a locked drawer like a man holding the town by the throat, waiting, patient as rot, for the season when everyone would stumble at once. That season came. Peter Voss fell ill, that autumn a fever that settled in his chest and would not lift, and while he lay burning, the note came due. Marielle went to the bank herself, in her good dress, with the mill's clean books under her arm to show that the debt was sound, that the mill would pay in full by spring, that all she asked was time. Ezra Crane listened with his hands folded and his eyes half closed, and when she was finished he told her, in that soft voice, that the bank was not in the business of charity, that the times were hard for everyone, that the law was the law. He foreclosed on the mill while her husband was still alive to hear the news, and Peter Voss died 3 days later. Some said of the fever, and some said of the shame. And Marielle Voss buried him in the churchyard on the north bank, in a plot Crane's bank technically owned. Within the month, the house on Ash Lane went too, sold out from under her for the balance of the note, and she stood in the road with a coat and a tin cup and $19.40, 41 years old, and everyone she had ever helped, too frightened of the bank to be seen helping her. That is how a woman comes to buy a rotting boat. She had walked the south bank in the gray dawn with nowhere left to go, and her feet, of their own accord, carried her to the old landing where the kingfisher lay half drowned in the reeds, and she stood over it the way you stand over the grave of a friend. It was a wreck. 4 winters of neglect since Absalom died had opened its seams. The water in its belly was skinned with ice. A willow had begun to grow through the stern seat. But Marielle Voss did not see a wreck. She saw her father's hand in the sweep of the strakes, for Otto Voss had built this very hull half a century before, and she saw the old ferryman's love in the worn place on the pole rail where his hands had rested 10,000 times, and she saw, though she could not have said why, a place to stand. The clerk at the bank, a nervous young man named Willis, who did what Crane told him, sold her the derelict for $11 and a form she signed with a steady hand, and he laughed about it that evening at the tavern. And by the next morning the whole of Halcyon Bend was laughing too. The Voss woman, ruined and mad, had spent near everything she had left on a boat that would not float, to live in, they supposed, like a muskrat in the mud. She let them laugh. She had $8.40 and a purpose, and she had learned long ago from her father that the river finds the lie in everything. So she meant to build something true. The first days, she simply bailed. She bailed the kingfisher's belly dry with her tin cup, hour after hour, kneeling in the cold water until her hands went numb. And she pulled the willow sapling out by its roots, and she scraped 4 years of black leaf rot from the boards. And slowly, under the filth, the old hull began to show itself again sound, mostly, where her father's joinery held, wounded only where the caulking had let go. She built a lean-to of driftwood on the landing and slept there. She ate what the river gave. And on the 4th day, working her caulking iron along the garboard seam where the bottom planks met the keel, the deepest, oldest seam in any boat, the one her father called the spine of the promise, her iron struck something that was not wood and not stone. It gave off a dull, dry, hollow sound, the sound of a sealed space where no sealed space should be. She stopped. She knelt in the half-light of the hull with her heart going hard, and she ran her raw fingers along the boards, and she understood, with a boatwright's certainty, that the bottom of the Kingfisher was false. There was the floor she stood on, and then, below it, cunningly fitted, so that no water had ever reached it in 50 years, there was a second floor, a dry, sealed compartment built into the very keel of the boat, its lid pitched and pegged and paid over with tar so skillfully that a lifetime of passengers had trodden across it and never known. Only a builder would have found it. Only her father's daughter, working the spine seam by hand, would ever have known to look. And carved small into the underside of the false floor, where she found it, when at last she pried the lid free in the last gray light of that day, were 3 words in the old ferryman's rough letters. For the Bend. Inside the dry compartment, wrapped in oilcloth gone dark with age, lay a cedar chest no bigger than a bread box, and it was heavy in her hands with the particular honest weight of metal. She did not open it there. She carried it up to her lean-to, and she sat with it through the whole of that night, not from greed, but from a kind of reverence, the way you sit with a letter from the dead before you have the courage to read it. And when the first light came gray over the cottonwood, she opened the cedar chest, and what slept inside the hull of that rotting ferry boat began, slowly, to rewrite everything. There was gold. That was the first thing, and the least of it, though it was more money than Marielle Voss had ever seen a chamois bag heavy with double eagles, gold coins struck across 40 years. The ferryman's whole life of small fares and forgiven debts turned, somehow, into a fortune by the plain, invisible miracle of a poor man who saved everything and spent almost nothing on himself. But it was not the gold that made her hands shake. Beneath the coin lay a ledger bound in cracked leather, and beneath the ledger a sheaf of legal papers tied in faded ribbon, and beneath those a single letter in the ferryman's hand addressed, impossibly, to no name at all, addressed only to whoever loves this river enough to look. She read the letter first, and by the end of it she was weeping in a way she had not let herself weep since the day they lowered Peter into Crane's ground. Absalom Reed, it turned out, had not been a poor man by accident. He had been a rich man by choice. The ledger, when she worked through its close columns by candle over the following days, told the true and hidden history of Halcyon Bend, and it was a history Ezra Crane had spent 15 years trying to bury. For Absalom, Reed had been more than the ferryman. He had been the last living trustee of the Bend Commons, an old covenant drawn up by the town's founders in 1854 and witnessed at the county seat that set aside the mill lot, the school lot, the smithy, the general store, and the landing itself, not as private property to be bought and sold, but as a common trust held for the people of the town in perpetuity, the rents and profits to be kept and reinvested for the good of all. The founders had feared exactly the kind of man Crane was. They had built the covenant to be a fortress, and they had given the deeds and the trust charter into the keeping of the one man they trusted above all others to be incorruptible, the ferryman who carried everyone and charged the poor, nothing with instructions to hide them somewhere. No thief would think to look and to pass them to a worthy successor before he died. But Absalom Reed had grown old faster than he meant to, and the new bridge had taken his trade and his standing, and Crane, who had gotten wind of the covenant and knew that if the true deeds ever surfaced, his whole empire of foreclosures would collapse like a rotten dike, had made sure, in his soft and patient way, that the old ferryman died, forgotten and alone, his warnings dismissed as the ramblings of a has-been. Crane had searched the ferryman's shack after his death. The town remembered that, though they had thought he was only being thorough about the bank's small debts. He had found nothing, because the deeds were not in the shack. They were sealed in the spine of a boat that everyone, including Crane, had written off as worthless rot. And so for 4 years, the single document that could break Ezra Crane's grip on Halcyon Bend had lain not 10 feet from where he foreclosed, on family after family, sleeping in the dark, waiting for the one person in the county who would ever think to pry up the false floor of the Kingfisher. The papers were sound. That was the thing Marielle checked first and last, with the cold, careful eye her father had trained into her. She read the covenant 3 times. She read the founder's signatures and the county clerk's seal and the witness marks, and she compared the dates against everything she knew, and she understood, with the same certainty she felt about a true built seam, that this was no lie. Every foreclosure Crane had made on Common's land, the mill, the smithy, the store, the school, her own mill, the very ground of the churchyard had been made against property he never had the right to lend against in the first place, because it had never legally belonged to the borrowers to pledge, nor to the bank to seize. It belonged to the town. It had always belonged to the town. And the ferryman's gold, the letter said in its plain, rough words, was to be the seed, the fund to hire a lawyer, to pay the back taxes, to rebuild whatever the years had broken so that the covenant could be raised up again and the Bend restored to the people who lived in it. For the Bend, he had carved into the keel. He had meant it as a will and a weapon and a prayer. And now it was all 3. And it was in the hands of a woman Ezra Crane had thrown into the road with a tin cup. She could have run. We will not pretend the thought did not come to her. In the cold, in the hunger, with a bag of gold in her lap and the whole county laughing at her name, she could have taken the double eagles and gone west, and lived out her days in some soft place where no one had ever heard of Halcyon Bend or Ezra Crane. But Marielle Voss had been raised at a table where the forgotten were fed, and taught by a father that you build so there is no lie in it, and loved by a husband whose grave sat in stolen ground, and she found she could not carry a fortune built for a whole town away from the town that needed it. That was the moment, if there was one, that the story truly turned, not when she found the gold, but when she decided what it was for. She sewed the double eagles into the hem of her coat. She wrapped the deeds in oilcloth and hid them where only a builder would look back in the spine of the boat, for she trusted the Kingfisher's keeping more than any bank's, and she took 2 coins and the ledger, and she walked 40 miles to the county seat to find an honest lawyer, because she meant to fight. Ezra Crane heard of it, of course. He heard of everything. That was how he had grown so large. He heard that the Voss woman had been to the county recorder's office asking to see the original town plat, and that she had hired a young lawyer named Judith Alcott, a woman lawyer, rare as rain in that country, and all the harder for Crane to intimidate because she had nothing he could foreclose on, and no reputation among the men who feared him. Crane came to the South landing himself, then, in his black coat, on a gray afternoon, and he stood over Marielle where she knelt at her caulking, as if she were still the beggar he had made her. He was cordial. He was always cordial. He told her he had heard she'd had a run of curious luck. He told her that old boats sometimes held old rubbish, and that rubbish had a way of causing more trouble than it was worth, and that he would, out of Christian charity, buy the wreck back from her and anything she might have found in it for $200, cash, today, and let bygones be bygones. $200 to a woman with a tin cup. It was, in its way, the most dangerous thing he had ever done, because it told Marielle Voss exactly how frightened he was. And a frightened Ezra Crane, she understood, was a man who had already begun to lose. She refused him gently, and he stopped being cordial. He came at her the way he came at everyone, through paper and fear. He had the county's compliant sheriff post a notice that her lean-to on the landing was a trespass and an eyesore, to be cleared. He put it about that the deeds she claimed to hold were forgeries, that she was a madwoman and a swindler trading on the good name of a dead ferryman. He leaned on the young clerk Willis to swear the boat had been sold with all contents remaining bank property, so that anything found inside belonged, he argued, to him. And when none of that moved her, he did the thing such men always come to at last. One moonless night in the last week of November, a fire started on the South Landing, and the lean-to burned, and men Crane would later swear he had never hired, tried to burn the Kingfisher to the waterline with it, to send whatever slept inside its hull back into the dark forever. But the deeds did not burn, because Marielle Voss had not built like a woman who trusted her luck. She had built like her father's daughter. When she hid the papers back in the spine of the boat, she had also, quietly, made a second thing, a copy of the covenant and the ledger's key pages, sworn and stamped before the county recorder in Judith Alcott's office, and locked in the county's own fireproof vault, 40 miles away, where Crane's reach did not go. And the Kingfisher itself she had by then hauled up out of the reeds and recaulked seam by seam through the freezing nights until it floated true, so that when the fire came, the men who set it found not a rotting hulk mired in mud, but a sound boat riding light at its line. And when they put their torches to the tar, it caught and flared, and the whole burning landing lit the South Bank orange, and it woke the town. That was the thing Crane had never understood about a river town. The thing old Absalom Reed had told a girl with sawdust in her braids half a century before. A river town lives or dies by whether its people can reach one another. They came down to the water in their nightclothes, the whole poor South Bank, the widow Hetty Lund and the blacksmith Gideon Ross, whose smithy Crane held a false note on, and the storekeeper and the school teacher and 40 others, and they saw a lone woman beating at the flames on the deck of a burning boat, trying to save not herself but a thing she said was theirs, and they picked up buckets, and they waded in, and they put the fire out together. And something in Halcyon Bend that had been asleep as long as the chest in the keel woke up that night and did not go back to sleep. After the fire, it moved quickly, the way a true thing moves once the town is behind it. Judith Alcott filed the covenant with the district court. The original deeds from the Kingfisher's spine and the sworn copy from the county vault matching seal for seal, witness for witness, and no lawyer of Crane's could shake them because there was no lie in them to find. The court appointed a receiver. The old trust of the Bend Commons, dormant for 15 years, was found to be valid and unbroken, and every foreclosure Ezra Crane had ever made against Commons land was voided in a single gray morning in the county courthouse, the mill, the smithy, the store, the school, the churchyard where Peter Voss lay, all of it restored at a stroke to the people it had always belonged to. The Double Eagle's Absalom Reed had saved a fare at a time across 40 years, paid the back taxes and the lawyer and the receiver, with enough left over to seed exactly what the founders had dreamed, a common fund held in trust, its profits kept for the good of all. The mill ground wheat again by spring, and the schoolhouse got its broken windows and a teacher's proper wage, and the ferry ran once more from the poor South Bank to the rich North Market, free for any who could not pay, the way it had in the ferryman's day. Ezra Crane was not hanged. This is not that kind of story. And Marielle Voss was not that kind of woman. She had buried enough to know that vengeance is only grief that has curdled. But the covenant's undoing of his foreclosures took from him nearly everything, for his whole fortune had been built on Commons land he never truly owned, and the discovery of how he had gained it, the fire he could not quite be tied to but that no one in the Bend believed he had not set, the dead ferryman he had let die friendless to bury the truth, took from him the one thing such men cannot live without, which is the deference of their neighbors. No one would sit with him. No one would sell to him. The soft voice found no one left to soften. Within the year, he sold his emptied bank to a plain and honest man from the county seat, and left Halcyon Bend by the North Road in his black coat, alone, unmourned, forgotten as thoroughly as he had once tried to make the ferryman forgotten. And if there is justice in this world, and we believe on our best days that there is, then that is what it most often looks like. Not the noose, but the quiet, complete withdrawal of a town that has finally remembered it can reach one another. And Marielle Voss? She was made the new trustee of the Bend Commons by a vote of the whole town taken on the mended deck of the Kingfisher, and she kept the books in her clean, sloping hand for the rest of her long life. And she never took for herself more than a trustee's honest wage, though she could have taken all of it and no one would have blamed her. She rebuilt her father's mill and gave half its profit to the common fund. She raised the ferryman's boat up as fine as it had ever been, and ran the crossing herself in the good weather, free for the poor, and she carved the name back into its bow with her own hands, not Kingfisher this time, but Absalom, so the man who had carried the town's kindness for 40 years would go on carrying it after his death. She fed the forgotten of Halcyon Bend at her table the way her mother had, and she took in the widow Hetty and taught the blacksmith's daughter to read a boat's grain. And slowly the sorrow that had sat in her house like a fourth chair became instead a whole town's worth of chairs pulled up close, and that she would tell you if you asked her, was the true fortune. The ferry boat held not the gold, which was spent, but the reaching, which was not. She was 41 years old, and she had lost everything a person can lose: her husband, her home, her mill, her standing, all of it taken by a man who smiled like he was counting your money. And with almost the last of what she had, she bought a rotting ferry boat that made grown men laugh into their collars, because her father had taught her that the most valuable things are often the ones that look, to the careless eye, like nothing at all, and because water finds the lie in everything, and she meant to build something true. What slept inside that hull was not, in the end, the gold or even the deeds. What slept inside was a promise a dying man had made to a town for the Bend, carved into the keel where only love would look, and Marielle Voss found it because she was the only person left in the county who would kneel in the cold mud and honor a wreck instead of writing it off. That is the whole of it, really. The world is forever writing things off: old boats, old men, ruined women, forgotten towns, and calling it good sense. And every so often someone refuses and kneels down and looks closer and finds the sealed and sleeping thing that rewrites a life and wakes a whole community back into being. Settle in, we told you at the start, and let us tell you the story of Marielle Voss. Now you know why it was worth the telling. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this one. It means more than you know that you spent this quiet hour here with us and with Marielle. If her story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that the thing others laughed at might be the very thing that saves them. And before you go, sit with us on one question, the way Marielle sat with that cedar chest before she found the courage to open it. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had written off? And how did it change you? Tell us in the comments. We read every one, and we carry them with us. Until next time, keep looking closer at the things the world calls worthless. Keep reaching for the people the world forgot, and stay close.